Hello and welcome or welcome back to Read Becca for another weekly chatty catch up on my week in reading, everything that I read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading, and roughly some chit chat about the week. So this week was a good reading week. I think I'm completely back on track with reading. So this week was the first week where I felt the reading joy again. This year, earlier in the year, I was having a lot of struggles, both with time and mental blockades on my reading that were very frustrating to me. So I was still reading quite a bit, but for me it wasn't where I wanted to be and I was feeling a lot of frustration. So I am through that. And as a result, I have read a ton. Some things I can't talk about and some things I can. So I guess the things I can't talk about are that I have finished Book 2 prize reading for this round. Yay, I'm very excited by that because I'm finished with some time to spare, and that means I'm thinking about my rankings now. I have not yet filed them, but I will do that probably this weekend. But I have plenty of time, so that's great. I also did finish several other things. So I think the first one we will talk about is Mislaid in Parts Half Known, the 9th book in the Wayward Children series by McGuire. And that means I am caught up on this series because it's the latest book that just came out a couple months ago, and I enjoyed it, but I feel a bit mixed about it. I feel mixed about it because in this series, the books alternate between books set here, primarily at the home for wayward children, these children who've gone to Portal Worlds and come back. And so half the books are there, and then alternately, we have a Portal World book. And this one has dinosaurs on the cover, so kind of ostensibly, it was going to be the dinosaur Portal World book, right? But it's not really that. And it's hard to talk about this because there is so much in this book that hinges on previous books. And also, this is a direct continuation of Book 8 as well. So that is kind of unique in this series. I think every book previously has, for the most part, been a coherent standalone story. Not so with this one. I would strongly urge you to not pick this up as your first book. In fact, for me, at a minimum, you must have read Lost in the Moment and Found, Book 8, before this, because this is a direct continuation. I think that story on its own holds together pretty well, but this one starts right after it, so you definitely want to have read that, since the primary character is also the same. So you need to know everything that she went through and why she's doing what she does here. You also kind of need to have read the whole series, though. So I would go even further to tell you, don't read this unless you've read the entire series, which has not been the case so far for any of the books prior to now. Here you have characters showing up. We have an initial cast kind of together that are people we know from before, and they're not really introduced, but other additional people keep popping up over the course of the adventure that our main character takes along this ragtag crew on. And they're not introduced at all. There are also really major, I guess, world building elements and terminology that are used that are kind of critical to the story that we learned in past books, but are not explained whatsoever here. So I think you could probably intuit enough to understand those things and read the book and make sense of it, but you're not going to really have a full depth of knowledge of what they're talking about, or the people they're talking about at all, if you haven't read the entire series. So that's why I feel kind of mixed. It's also kind of a letdown because it was not the Dinosaur World book, right? Everybody was excited about that. So there is a Dinosaur World. It wasn't a bait and switch completely. And there's a decent amount there. And it's very unique and creative what's done there. However, it's not the bulk of the book. The bulk of the book is an adventure and not limited to this Dinosaur World. And I feel for me, this was kind of one of the very middle of the road books, and that's why I have mixed feelings, because it is such a continuation of the previous book that it feels like an incomplete book on its own. Even though the previous one did kind of stand on its own, I think it would have been better if the two had been mashed together into a single novel. And there were moments of like really insightful, touching, connective commentary, I guess, like messaging that came through that feels like it built from the larger series, and I thought those were great, but they were kind of brief moments. The rest of it felt sort of forgettable, I guess. It was a fine story. So I think that's where I'm going with this, is it was fine. I enjoyed it while I was reading it, but it wasn't a standout in this series in any way for me. So the next one that I read was another Liz Rosenberg biography, and this time it was House of Dreams, The Life of Ellen Montgomery, and it has illustrations by Julie Morestad, which is a different illustrator than the previous book that I had read. I also read Liz Rosenberg bio of Louisa May Alcott, and the illustrations have the same vibe, oddly, but are completely different illustrators. So I will make sure to insert some of those photos. So funny enough, I had actually picked this one up first. Well, I had the choice between the two. They were both sitting on the shelf, and I decided on this one for People April. But then a couple days after Alcott April was announced, so I went back to the library and got the Louisa May Alcott bio, and then read it first, and finally got around to this one. So it has returned to the library at this point because it was due back, since it was one of the earliest books I had picked up for People April. So this week is my catch-up week, basically, from People April stuff that I piled up. So this I enjoyed so much. I really loved it. It was a lovely book for the same reasons that I enjoyed the narrative style, I guess, or the storytelling, if you can say that, in a biography, of communicating her life and her desires and the things we know about her introspectively. So Rosenberg, I think, is a fascinating storyteller when it comes to nonfiction. What interested me the most here, I think, is learning so much about things from Ellen Montgomery's life that she twisted and fictionalized into her actual work, into her stories, especially the Anne stories. But obviously, Ellen Montgomery is the author of Anne of Green Gables. I should have prefaced with that. So that's her most famous work. She had many other works, but this is a biography of her life and so many similarities. Her growing up on Prince Edward Island, becoming a teacher, despite the fact that her grandfather was very against women teachers, and they always had kind of a contentious relationship about that. Her being sort of raised by her grandparents was inspiration for Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert. And Marilla specifically was a connection with her grandmother, who was always kind of cold to her a bit. And just seeing those tie-ins from reality to the story she was writing, the struggles that she went through, the fact that she was exactly that very dramatic, romantic person that Anne is, made me feel such a connection for her. But also at the same time, you saw her make choices in her life that didn't indulge in the fantasies that Anne was able to. And so I think she was living out a fantasy in some ways in her works. So for instance, she had this kind of short-term romantic love affair with a man who was betrothed. And so she had this kind of great passionate love, but it never went anywhere because he was betrothed. And then she had a marriage that was not very passionate. She had sort of a marriage of convenience, and she loved her children very much, but her marriage, her romantic relationship, was always just kind of practical and cold, and he never appreciated her work, and she didn't seem to really appreciate his work either, or agree with him in a lot of ways. And so seeing that was a little heartbreaking, because we know her for this kind of sweeping, lifelong back and forth love story, and yet she was so withdrawn in that space for the majority of her life. She and her husband were living in the same space, and she was focused on mothering a lot and working whenever she could, and he basically thought she should not. And meanwhile, she kept doing it and ignoring him against his wishes. So it was a really interesting dynamic to read about, but also kind of heartbreaking. There was just so much to this that I really enjoyed. Oddly, I guess from the writing perspective, this was supposed to be a YA book, and the previous one, the Alcott bio that I read, was supposed to be a middle grade. But I feel like for me, that was kind of switched. The writing here, or the storytelling here, felt a lot more simple and straightforward. So I wouldn't be surprised if this one was done earlier. I didn't bother to check, but this felt very simple and straightforward to read without being childish in any way. So I don't feel like you don't need to be a YA reader to get into this. It felt very thought through in how the information about her life was being presented and the things that she went through, connecting those to things that were going on during the time. And yeah, I really connected with this and feel like I learned a lot, and I feel like this grasped and condensed the life of Montgomery into a really consumable package. So yeah, I feel like it was a very good biography and presented in a really interesting way that was easy to fly through. So I think that's all I have to say about that one, but I do highly recommend it. I really enjoyed this. I think of the two, I did enjoy the Alcott more, but I think that's mainly because we had a lot more writing from her. It seems like Montgomery destroyed an awful lot of her personal writings, especially things like journals and diaries from her young life. It seemed like she just kept burning things. And if we had that, I think this would have been able to provide a more dense and complex picture of her inner life that we didn't get as much of. But I like both of them. So I think I would return to Liz Rosenberg for sure as an author. So I think that with that, the last book was also for People April, but surprise, it actually fits for Mental Health May. I did not know. So this is Radical Love, Learning to Accept Yourself and Others by Zachary Levi, who is an actor. If you have been around for a couple months, you know why I picked this up. Because I was watching through all of the DC comic book universe, and he is Shazam in the DC comic book universe. And so this kind of appeared on the shelves at the right time when I had just watched that. And I do like him very much as a person. We don't agree on quite a lot of things, I think, personally, but he seems very well-intentioned and good-hearted and like a genuine person. So I just picked it up basically based on that and was expecting a pure celebrity memoir. And this is not that. This is completely a mental health memoir. This was finished after the lockdowns, so it does incorporate a little bit of that, but most of this was written before that. And he addresses that in the introduction. Effectively, he had a complete depressive breakdown, including and up to suicidal ideation. So beware going in that this talks about those sort of things very candidly. And mainly it focuses on like the emotional stuff. Thankfully he never gets to that point, but he gets to some very dark emotional places here. And him talking through that is so open and honest, I think. And one of the things I like about this so much is that the tone is really uneven. And for me, that shows me that he probably did really write this versus like a ghostwriter taking over and just doing kind of cheesy celebrity memoir stuff. Here we have, when he's talking through the mental health moments, it's very raw, very emotional. When he's talking about things he's learned, kind of the more factual things, it's presented in a kind of a more presenting way. And when he's talking about his childhood, it's in a very, very casual tone. So it feels a little uneven in that, in terms of the tone, but for me, I actually liked it more because of that, I think. Because it feels like we're getting his voice rather than somebody that has edited or written for him to kind of keep it flat. And this was a hard read because he is diving into the hardest times of his life. He talks in the introduction about the fact that he was writing this book in order to end cap what he thought was a singular depressive episode, and then the lockdowns happened. And at that point, he had another breakdown, and he realized that this very much is still a work in progress for him, that his mental health is not going to just be fixed. And so he actually kind of shelved the manuscript and didn't want to release it at that point because he didn't feel like he had the happy ending. And he addresses that as well, and I like that he did that and talked about the fact that he doesn't think he necessarily will have, or many people can have, that clean, happy ending. It's going to be a work in progress for the rest of his life. So this is a raw account of his background, his childhood, living with a emotionally abusive mother who is, it seems, very narcissistic, very manipulative, gaslighting. So there are definite depictions of that. And as is fairly typical of performers, he, as a child, sought to entertain and make people laugh in order to deflect that negative attention. And hearing those accounts were really hard. The accounts of his family struggling with that, both him and his siblings being affected by that, but also experiencing almost the same things or other severe types of abuse through bullying at school, and having teachers not really recognize it, having the people who are supposed to care and step in not do so, was the really hardest part, I think, for me in his young life. But as he got older, of course, he found a way to engage this in a really healthy way in pursuing acting and comedy as a career. And that finally was a really positive source of reinforcement for him, but he was still engaging it in kind of toxic ways at times. So initially what was really good for him became also harmful. He discusses things like going no contact with his family and the struggles as he moved into adulthood and had his own agency and autonomy, and his mom not being able to deal with that, and that really having a toll on him. And so I think finally he moves on and has these romantic relationships and finds a woman he wants to marry, and seems like things are falling into place, and then they get divorced. And it seems like the first step in the catalyst for him having a complete breakdown and going to the darkest place, the lowest low of his life. And so the majority of this book is actually doing a deep dive on his breakdown, going through every step of the way of the process of entering inpatient treatment, having, sought out initially, like realizing I have to go somewhere today, and going to a medical facility nearby to him and kind of going through the intake process, just the basics like that, talking to family about what he was doing, having to deal with it from a work perspective, and the process of going through that intake or not the intake, that treatment. And so that was all really fascinating, not something I've heard somebody really talk, I think, in depth about, just the gist of what you go through in that. And I think he did such a good job of relaying that in a way that was very personal. And I think his progression and the way that he was treated, he talks about certain like specific techniques that were used on him, for instance, and why they worked for him. And I think that's really important for people to hear when they are learning about mental health. And I think that Zachary does a great job of making that information accessible in this book. So he's trying very much to present usable information that he's learned. So I really liked that. I think a lot of this was very hard to read, very raw, and kind of to what I said earlier, I feel like he's so genuine here. One of the things that I struggled with really hard, and I feel he kind of can't see the forest for the trees on, is that he's religious, or at points here, he does talk about kind of losing faith. He doesn't go into it in depth, but through this whole book, I would say, safe to say, he is religious. He has an ongoing faith in God that seems to be Christian. And so that is pretty prominent if that sways you either direction and toward reading or against reading this. For me, it doesn't sway me either way. But I think he can't see the forest for the trees because at one point in his treatment, he's talking to someone who is there for this inpatient treatment to support him, not in a medical or psychiatric facility, or not facility, capacity, but who is there to support him. And that person and him have talked about the fact that they're both religious, and they have very shared beliefs. And in a really hard moment, that person attempts to influence and manipulate him religiously or for religious reasons, and kind of specifically says they would get in trouble for doing this. So they know what they're doing is wrong. And he perceives that after the fact in the writing of this book as very positive, like what this person did, even though they knew it was wrong. It wasn't wrong because of religion. Obviously they had talked about religion before, but because they were using this extremely emotionally vulnerable moment to impose religion on him. And that's what was wrong. And to me, it was clearly manipulative and bordering on like spiritual abuse, because they were using their kind of position of power over his vulnerable situation. And yet he sees it as totally positive. And I struggled with that, especially because he expresses that to him, this was like the opposite emotionally for him of what his mom was doing. Yes, it's different in some ways, but it's exactly the same. It's the same sort of manipulation. It's just being delivered with sugar instead of poison. That's all. And in the same way, when he talks about his mom, he seems to perceive her religious practice as like this one good thing in her life where she was doing the right thing. And yet, the way he talks about it through the whole book, every time it comes up, it's so clear that this is an extension or an outstretching of all of her toxic manipulative behaviors, what she's doing religiously. And so it feels like this massive blind spot that he's talking about really glowingly through the book, and I'm just like horrified reading what he's saying. So I struggled with those parts, especially as someone who is sort of sensitive to that aspects of like things that cross the line into spiritual abuse. I'm very sensitive to. So those were hard things to read because he is very, very on board with religion and does talk about it quite a bit through this book. But otherwise, I think that I got a lot out of this. I think that he gives a great account of his personal experience that is extremely open and direct on a topic that so many people do need to hear more direct discussion of. And he talks about that a bit, about how much there's stigma surrounding mental health. And that's why this is really perfect for Mental Health May, because it's all about tackling the stigma and being open and honest about our mental health. And so I thought, yeah, this was a perfect one to pick up for the month with that readathon in mind. And completely unexpectedly, I hadn't even looked at the synopsis to know that's what this was about, but I thought it was very, very good. So that is what I finished this week. And I have rambled on an awful lot about those. I don't have very much in progress. I only have one thing going other than my short fiction stuff, and that is The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. I had been hoping I would get it in for Horror Mayhem and had a very long wait for the audiobook, and it has come in. So, joy of joys. I'm listening to it. I am loving it. I think this is my last horror book from T. Kingfisher to read, though, which is kind of a bummer. However, T. Kingfisher is extremely prolific, so probably by the time I finish it, she will have another book lined up. But that's all I have on my docket for the coming week. However, I will definitely read more than that, especially because this is a 3-day weekend. So I am totally expecting to read at least a couple books this weekend. Yeah. And I was planning on taking a day off of reading, in fact, but, and I don't know if you can see, my arms are all bruised up. I wound up completely accidentally ruining my day off because I listened to audiobooks a ton. From walking, I went to the park because we're supposed to have very hot weather, but I walked at the park. I put together a bed. So I guess we're into life updates now. We're off of reading. I put together a bed because the basement cleanup is progressing very slowly. I think I should be able to get everything sorted out and stuff donated. I have culled a lot of stuff, but my bed frame was down in the basement, part of it was anyway, other than my headboard, because I had just not put it together after several years from my dog not being able to use it. My dog's not around anymore, so he's been gone for a year and a half, and I had kept meaning to put together the bed again, and I finally did it. And I'm all bruised up now because putting together a large bed on your own is rather difficult. In fact, I put it together upside down once, which was not great. I had it the right way the first time, and then the holes were not lining up, and so I flipped things upside down, and it was the wrong way. I had it right the first time, so I had to put it together twice. However, that all was good. I just need to finish sorting piles, basically, at this point. Everything is cleared out from the basement closet, so it just needs pile sorting and then things to go back where they belong. As far as my cat, thank you for all the kind words, hoping he would be okay. He was very much concerning me because he was not himself and kind of drooling and stuff, which is not good. Like, that's a concern for teeth, definitely. But he seems to be completely fine, no issues. Most likely, it's either something viral that he picked up from Dusty, the foster cat, because they have just begun cross-pollinating space, directly interacting. So that's possible. While Dusty is vaccinated, there are things like calicovirus. Like, even if cats are vaccinated, it's extremely dangerous for young kittens, so you don't want them to get it, but adult cats can still get it, and it's kind of like a cold, and they can get it even if they are vaccinated for it, but they just get a milder form. So it's possible it's something like that. It's also possible it's just from the stress, even. They can behave that way from stress, because cats really care a lot about their territory behaviorally, and so we're dealing with both having Dusty take over part of their territory and encroach on their territory now that he's out in the house a bit. And also me having shut off the basement means they lost a big chunk of their territory, so he could be very stressed. Rue is a very soft, sensitive boy. So who knows, but he seems to be completely fine and has bounced back, thankfully. Yeah, so that's lifey stuff, I think. I think that's it. The 3-day weekend, I have so much to do, but I think like the main thing I actually have to get done over this weekend is I need to get a couch. I've been living without a couch in my living room for, I don't know, 6 or 8 months now, because I cleared it out before they did the floors, in, I guess, beginning of December is when I got rid of it. And I meant to get a new one months ago. I can't remember which holiday it is. One of the holidays that has a big furniture sales, usually. So we're at a holiday weekend that usually has furniture sales. So I'm going to try and make it happen this weekend. But looking around, I have not had much luck looking for couches with anything that I even remotely like. I would also like to get a matching chair to replace the one that's right there, because I used to have like a large recliner, and now it's kind of a large accent chair, which is still much, much smaller and less comfortable. And that's my primary reading chair. So I would like a nice cushy reading chair. So I think that's my big exciting plan for the weekend for the most part. I have a lot of stuff I'm planning to do, but nothing really of mention. And cleaning out the basement. That's gonna be a big chunk of time. So what else? Watching updates. We're way out of order here. Watching updates. I think that I finished 3 seasons of Making the Cut, or all 3 seasons. I think that's all there are. Making the Cut, which is it's the same thing as Project Runway. So I think Tim and Heidi, I can't remember which of them, was being kicked off Project Runway or being let go. And the other one basically said it's both of us or neither. And so they both wound up leaving Project Runway and starting their own show. So that's what this is. It is the same as Project Runway, but I think they lean toward more established designers who already have kind of a bit of public awareness and a brand identity, I guess. And I also think they are probably making casting decisions that I like more, because there's very little drama. So it's much more supportive between the people, and everyone seems like really, really friendly, versus I think Project Runway, they have probably chosen people more often that will create drama. At least in recent years, that has definitely ramped up. So I did very much enjoy it, but it was not very memorable. It was a really enjoyable reality competition show, though. What else did I watch? I also watched, because I have been on a Broadway kick this whole week after seeing Moulin Rouge. I've been listening to show tunes all week. I watched Hamilton, One Shot at Broadway. It doesn't really seem like there was only one shot at Broadway. It seemed like they were pretty destined to make it. But it was really interesting. It's a documentary about kind of the lead up, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, his background, and like interview clips, all that kind of stuff crammed into a little documentary that's only like an hour long. Lots of theater critics weighing in on why they think this was such a big hit and catalyst for things. So I really enjoyed it. The one thing I didn't like about it kind of is that there was voiceover through most of it, and the voiceover just felt very disconnected. I didn't really like the person doing the voiceover, though it was like fine. It just wasn't very lively or connected with what was going on so much. But I enjoyed it as a documentary. So I don't have any recommendations for videos noted down this week, so I think I will leave you there after sticking with me for this long ramble. Thank you. Let me know, as June is approaching, I feel like I haven't heard about very many readathons. So what readathons are you all participating in? I know I've heard about June on the Range and Amazing Readathon, and those are kind of it, I think. Amazing Readathon I would love to participate in, but I don't really do Discord, and I think it's very heavily focused there. And it's also, I think, a little intense for me. It's Amazing Race themed or based on the format of that. So you kind of start off and go on these different legs of the race around the world. But each leg is different prompts that are announced kind of on the fly at certain times. And to keep up with that just sounds like a lot for me right now. I'm needing to be a little bit more loosey-goosey. And June on the Range, I definitely do plan to participate. So let me know if you've heard about other readathons, because I just haven't heard very much. Yeah, so I think that is all for me today. I hope you're having a really wonderful reading week, and I will see you next time.